There was a time in our history when Black Americans succeeded without government assistance, and their communities literally thrived. With this rich history of success and achievement, why aren't young Blacks being taught these facts today?
The wife of the man who claimed he owned me taught me how to read, Mrs. Hugh Auld. She'd been teaching me for nearly 1 year, until that day that I recall so vividly. You see, if you were the color of my skin, there were laws that were stated quite clearly. You were not allowed to read. Mr. Hugh Auld, my master, had learned, his wife had been teaching me. And he walked into the room where we were, stood over top of us, and shouted out, "Don't you ever teach them how to read! Don't you ever teach them how to read! Once you teach them how to read, they're free! Don't you ever teach them how to read! Not in my house! They're no good to themselves or to us. Don't you ever teach them how to read! Not in my house," he said.
I was recently talking with a group of major African American bishops. And with those bishops, I pulled out the original documents because we have literally tens of thousands of original documents out of Black history, out of all this history. And I'm showing all these legislators, all the first Black U.S. senators that were Republican, all the state leaders that were Republican, Black leaders. And we're going through and I'm showing the records out of Congress where the Democrats say, yes, we started the Klan. That was so going through all of this, and these Black bishops asked me, how come we don't hear this in our history books?
There are two reasons, in my view, why the young Blacks are not being taught their Black history as it relates to the times when Black people flourish in this country politically and economically, because they don't want the Black people to know that. Why? Because if they knew all that, Black people would actually leave the plantation.
But the reason why they don't teach it is because it doesn't empower supposedly the champion party of the little guy in this country.
Well, what is being taught in schools is revisionist history. I object to Black History Month. I think it ought to be history. Where Blacks made a contribution, you just show their face. Prior to the civil rights movement in the 50s, the Brown decision, there was a rich tradition of Black self-help. The Black colleges used to publish a journal of Black business success. But in order to get the civil rights laws to apply to Blacks, we had to present ourselves as victims of racism. So in order to do that, we had to cease publishing the accounts of our success.
The civil rights movement moved from the righteous cause of Dr. Martin Luther King to emphasizing a much more dependency culture. It's then that education changed. It was important, of course, to wipe out this idea that before the welfare and the affirmative action and so forth and the entitlement programs came along, they needed to wipe out that we actually achieved without that, because of course they were making the case that the only way that we could continue to succeed is if in fact we were assisted externally.
Well, even when they are taught about the heroes, they're taught about all of these things in a context of victimization.
You'll never see Booker T. Washington's name, and that has to do with the fact that they all, I think, came together essentially to support this dependency, victimization culture, and Booker T. Washington represented the antithesis of that. And so they couldn't show that before all of these different dependency programs that we actually had success in.
Of the 23 African Americans elected to the federal Congress, 13 had been slaves. Now, here's what really is fascinating with that. You're talking 1865, you're in slavery. You're talking 1875 years later, you're now a member of Congress. I mean, that's a remarkable transition. But let me make it even more remarkable. In the southern states that allowed slavery, in many of those states it was a capital offense to educate a slave. It could get you killed to teach a slave to read or write. But yet we're going from being a slave in 1865 to being a member of Congress in 1870. That's a lot of education to get in 5 years. They were self-educated. Now, how much education can you get in 5 years? You want to know? You go to a website, you look up neglected voices on the web. It has the speeches of these first 23 black congressmen. These are speeches given on the floor of Congress by these guys who have been self-educated. So your first class of black congressmen to come to Congress, 1871 and 72, all 7 were Republicans. And it turns out that the first 23 African Americans elected to Congress were all Republicans. And of those 23, they are a remarkable class.
Even in high school and in junior high school, what I found is that the period from when African Americans were slaves to the Civil Rights Movement, almost a gap of 100 years, that period is kind of just walked over as if African Americans are even a part of that history.
The first African American elected to Congress as a Democrat was not until 1935. And again, it was out of the state of Illinois, a free state, had always been free. But you did not have a Southern black elected as a Democrat until 1973. Came out of my state of Texas, Barbara Jordan. Came out of Georgia, Andrew Young. But to get Barbara Jordan out of my state of Texas, it took the U.S. Supreme Court intervening and ruling that the Democrats in the state of Texas had to redraw their lines so that a black could be elected in the state of Texas. That was not a problem with the Republicans. That's why the first 23 African Americans were Republicans, wide open, easy to get elected that way. It had been difficult for African Americans to be elected as Democrats. And that's part of the history back there that a lot of times folks don't understand.